In this lesson, we want to post the data back to the endpoint for the Google Apps script, and then we'll set up the do post, which is opposite of the do get. So it's just using the different method, and we can still use the same endpoint URL. So first of all, let's construct the form data. So setting up an object to house the form data that we're going to be sending through using JavaScript, creating new form data object. And then within that form data object, let's go ahead and append to it. So for the form data, we're going to append some new object information to it, give it a name of data, and then this can contain the JSON stringified version, as we want to send it as a string of the object that was passed in. So it's going to set up and send the form content, and using fetch to the same web URL. And because this is a post, let's add in the method of post, so the property of post method. And then within the body, we want to send over the form data contents, and fetch again promise based. So we want to also retrieve back whatever the response is. So it's going to have some response content that's going to come back, and then that response content we're going to return back and use the JSON format for the response contact. So we just got to make sure that we're sending it back as JSON. And then lastly, we can output the response data as data and output it into the console. So actually I'm going to rename this to JSON so that to avoid any confusion there. So it's going to be the final JSON object, and this information is coming from the server, so we need to still set that up. So let's go ahead and first we'll go back to our application and do a quick refresh on it. So now it's going to be making a post request, and it's not actually getting anything back from the server. And with Google Apps Script, when you do throw errors, you're going to see this, that it throws you a CORS error. That's because there's no do post. And oftentimes whenever you have to debug it, the best way to go is to just really break down your application and really simplify it. And then from there, you can make the return and do the updates as needed. So that's how I'm going to do the next part of this, where we're going to be using the do post to pick up the posted information. So going back into our project, and now instead of the do get function, let's do a do post function. So we can pick up the post request, and we'll pick up the post data within E. And here we'll do a return, and we'll just return back success for now. And then we'll create the app script functionality coming up in the next lesson. So let's go ahead and do a new deployment as we're updating the executable. And this one now is going to contain with post. Same, make sure that anyone has access. The web app is being executed by the current user. And let's go back here, clear it. And now whenever we do a request, and because we're not outputting it as a content service, so the same thing that we did over here, we have to output it as a content service, and we have to stringify the object. So let's update that and create an object called output. And then within this object, and we'll just have for the result object, and it will return back success, as it's expecting the JSON format to be returned back. So again, new deployment with JSON return, and just deploy that. So now we've got the new version. Go back to the sheet and test it one more time. Now it looks like that error is being thrown because the JSON output is not properly being output, and the reason is that it's not being stringified as JSON. So it's trying to output an object and it's not seeing it as a proper output for JSON. So make sure that you do stringify it. And this is often one of the questions that I get asked quite often by students, is that when they are making connections to the Google Apps Script output, they do run into the CORS issues, and the CORS issues oftentimes are going to be issue with the output of the content within the function. You can also create a test function in order to run and log out the output, just to make sure that you are outputting content as expected. So it's expecting a JSON string value of the output. So running the test function, we can see it's coming back as text output. And it's being returned back as regular JSON content because the stringified of the output. So let's go ahead and make a new deployment. And we'll call it working post, or hopefully it's working, and hit done. And then go back to the sheet, do a refresh on there, and now whenever we get the result coming back. So we can also, now that we know that that's all working, we can make some more additional complex functionality within the do post. So I'm going to just remove out that test function. And that's just a suggestion that if you are having some issues and you want to make sure that you're outputting content properly, you can go through and you can just make sure that things are being added as expected. So another thing maybe to add in here before we move on to the next lesson, we're going to write the function that's going to actually update the content for the sheet, is we want to make sure that we're actually sending data properly through to the server side, and that's going to be contained within the E object. So there's a number of options that you can do, and one of them that I usually like to do is I just usually like to return back the content as data, because now we've got it within an object. We've got the E, and the content is coming in as E parameter data. So that's going to be where the stringified content is going to be returned back. And every time you make some updates to the Google Apps script, just make sure that it's updating and you're redeploying it. So that's oftentimes as well an issue of one of the reasons why we might not have it working properly, is that we've not retrieving the data and sending it properly, and also doing the redeployment. So going back now that we see that we're passing in the data, so this is result up for row 3. Result is down for row 3. So we're retrieving the information properly on the server side. So that means that we're ready to add and update the data. So we've got the row information to use in Google Apps script. We're going to select the range, and then we know which column it is depending on if it's up or down, and we know which column to update within the Google spreadsheet. So that is coming up in the next lesson. So go ahead and update your client-side JavaScript code to make sure that it is being able to post data to the endpoint, to the Google Apps script URL. And we don't have to change the URL because we're using get to get the information from the URL, and that's just a regular fetch request to the URL. And we're also using post in order to post data to the endpoint. And then lastly, just to finalize it, we're just going to have to update, and we can run the get data again and just do a complete update of it. So once we're returning back the JSON object, and if it's successful, then we take output, we update the inner HTML just to be blank, and then we're going to make a request and get the data again, and we'll rebuild the list of items that we have available on the page. So now we've done that, and we get a result, and it does a rebuild of the items. And it has to make a separate request to the server. There's also a way you can do this without doing the refresh, that you can just update the value that's contained in there. So that will save you from doing the refresh. And of course, it's not going to be picking up the live data, but it's going to prevent it from having that refresh of the code. Or also you can just loop down and you can rebuild the indicators as well. So that's coming up next as we're going to be debugging the application.